Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Star Trek Deep Space Nine Season 3. This video is part of a series of videos where I review every episode of Deep Space Nine one season at a time. In this video, I will cover all the episodes of Season 3. So Season 3 of Deep Space Nine is a monumental season where the season had a huge uptake for the better. I think it's comparable to Season 3 of The Next Generation, where the show suddenly improved greatly and got really good. In fact, it may be the show at its best. It's a bit different than TNG, has the disparity between how good this season is and how good the two previous seasons were isn't as wide, simply because the first two seasons of Deep Space Nine were not quite as bad as the first two seasons of Next Generation. However, the first two seasons of Deep Space Nine had a lot of issues as the show was trying to find its footing, but I think in Season 3 it did find its footing. It's found its own voice, it's found its own niche, so in my opinion, this is Deep Space Nine at its best, where it really hit its stride. Season 3 introduced the Defiant, a warship assigned to the station so the crew no longer had to rely on those dinky runabouts. It also focused more on the Dominion introduced in the Season 2 finale as it explored them more, and they were always the ever-looming presence even when they didn't appear. I've heard some complain that the Dominion didn't appear enough in Season 3, but I disagree. I think if you compare it to other shows like Next Generation Voyager, where the main villain is the Borg actually hardly ever appears, maybe in 1 or 2 episodes, or the Klingons appear maybe in 3 or 4 episodes. So I think the Dominion did appear enough, and even when they weren't appearing, they were always the undercurrent, the underlining presence in the season. So I really think of Season 3 as the first really good Dominion season. But more than that, I think the show really developed all its main characters and started to really establish Deep Space Nine as a stable community. Characters like Sisko, Odo, Kira, Garrick, and Gul Dukat seemed stronger and more interesting, like the writers finally knew what to do with them. And the characters who hadn't worked in the past, it seems the writers finally solidified their characters and figured out what to do with them. Characters like Dax, Bashir, Rom, and Nog. And although Season 3 had some subpar episodes and not as many episodes that stood out, I'd say overall the tone was just more consistent. I felt like the writers had a real handle on the characters and the show. Deep Space Nine seemed to really gain its identity and no longer came off as simply a sister show of Next Generation. And although there are other great seasons of Deep Space Nine, like Season 6, I think it's different in the fact that Season 6 had more great episodes than Season 3 did, but it also had more worst episodes. So Season 3 was more consistent, where the majority of the episodes of the season I would give like a 7 or 8 out of 10 to. And most seasons were a bit more up and down than that. And I do prefer Season 3 to Seasons 4 and 5 because I think the show kind of lost its footing with the introduction of Worf and the Klingons, and it wasn't until the end of Season 5 that it found its footing again, whereas I feel Season 3 presented a strong, clear picture of Deep Space Nine as a strong independent show in its own right. Anyway, let's jump straight into the episode. So let's start with the 2-part premiere, The Search. So this is the episode where we're introduced into Defiant. I think they introduced the Defiant in a great way by having this Sisko just show up with the Defiant on the station, just decloaking while they're all freaked out about the Dominion, and then introducing that they're going to go on a mission to the Gamma Quadrant on the Defiant. So it's a great way to get the viewers invested in the Defiant, and they sort of introduce it and say how it's a warship. So I know some people were against the concept of a Federation warship or Starfleet warship, but I think it makes complete sense in the way they introduced in the episode as it was originally created to fight the Borg, which the Borg almost wiped out the Federation, so it totally makes sense that they would create some warships to combat that, and it makes sense that they see the Dominion as the new threat that the warships would be suited for. So I didn't have any issues with it. I think it's perfectly fine. And this episode did have some really high stakes as well, because the last, the season finale, Season 2, ended with this looming threat, or this great power. They showed how powerful the Dominion were, how powerful the Jem'Hadar were, how they had all this advanced technology, and so it established there was this looming threat just on the other side of the wormhole that they had to deal with. Now, I often think, well, they brought up the possibility of closing the wormhole, and I often wonder why they didn't just do that. I mean, there is the element with the prophets. They don't want to cut Bajor off from the prophets, but that wasn't really established until later seasons, if we're being honest. But whatever, I still think it was a really interesting story. And of course, we get the big reveal of Odo finally discovering his people. Now, this is something that, as I mentioned before, that I got kind of sick of them playing with Odo, not knowing where he's coming from. They had a lot of fake out episodes in the first 2 seasons where he thinks he's finding his people and not finding his people. So I was so gratified that he finally found his people. And I remember, I might have mentioned this before, the actor who plays Odo, Rene Auberjonois, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, he had was very much against when he heard that they were revealing who Odo's people were, and saying they thought it would ruin his character, and totally discovered what they revealed meant and how they were revealing it, and then he was totally on board. I completely disagree with him. I think we needed to know who his people were regardless of what the reveal was, because I was just getting sick of this whole, oh, who are my people? That storyline was getting tired. So remember when I first watched this, because I watched it in 2 parts. I watched the first part 1 week, and then the second part the next week as it aired. And I remember after the first part talking, to some people, and they had theories about, oh, the changelings are going to come to the station and they're going to save the day. Even like during the second part, in particular, where we see that the Dominion is putting a foothold on Deep Space Nine, and they're at the station, so we're thinking, oh, the changelings, they're going to come and save the day, and that's how this episode is going to be resolved. And so you think of the changelings as good guys, because Odo is a good guy and he's finding his family, so they're the good guys. But that, so I totally didn't see this ending. It was really a shocking reveal, which unfortunately people who were watching Deep Space Nine years after it aired might have already been aware of this reveal, because it had become a staple of the show that the changeling are bad guys, that they are the leaders of the Dominion. But when I first saw this and they came up with that reveal, it was a very shocking moment. It was a very effectively shocking moment, and it completely fits with how the changeling has been portrayed in this episode, with the leader, the female changeling leader, how she was very standoffish against Kira and very suspicious of solids, as she calls them. Totally fit in, totally makes sense that they'd be the leader of this evil empire. And also it fits in with established lore of the changelings that were sprinkled within the first 2 seasons, as they were seen as people who were hunted and persecuted by the humanoid inhabitants of the Gamma Quadrant. So it kind of makes sense that they would be sick of being persecuted and would fight back, and would thus form this powerful empire. So, also this episode introduced 2 supporting characters. One is Commander Eddington, or is it Lieutenant Commander Eddington, and he was okay. I kind of didn't like this character that much. I felt like he wasn't necessary, because this is kind of a rehash of what they did in season 1 with Bremen. If you remember Bremen all the way back from season 1, he only appeared in like 2 episodes. He was a Starfleet security, and Odo was being all pissy, oh, this is Starfleet security. So in this episode, they introduce Eddington. He's like, oh, I'm taking over Starfleet security. And Odo gets all pissy and he threatens to resign. And Kira has to give him a pep talk. I found this storyline a bit weak, because we already did this. It's a repeat of what we already did. And Odo should already be aware that Starfleet wants a security officer. So it seemed like he just kind of rehashed. And overall, I don't know. Eddington, never really liked him that much as a supporting character. I think he was just there to be like kind of adversarial. He wasn't a flat-out villain, not yet anyway. He wasn't a flat-out villain, but and sometimes he was actually very helpful to the crew. He expressed a lot of admiration to Sisko, but he always had this side to him where he wasn't as like a trusted member of the crew, like the main cast. He was more of someone who was kind of, you had to watch your back around. You had to keep an eye on, even when he was being friendly and helpful. And I don't really think he worked. I didn't think he was, that I don't think he was necessary to introduce this character. But the other character we got to introduce in this episode is a character I liked a lot more, and that was Commander Tyrol, who was a Romulan. But the issue is, she only appeared in this 2-parter. Never see her again. And I don't know. I've heard some opinions that agree with this, but I completely and totally disagree. I think this was a major mistake. She was introduced originally to be a recurring character, but they just wrote her off the show, which kind of is inconsistent continuity-wise, because in this episode she's like, I'm keeping everyone away from the cloaking device, and now all of a sudden, Starfleet officers can just operate the cloaking device and the Romulans don't care. So that's inconsistent. Now, plus, I just think it's a fascinating concept to have a Romulan as a regular member of Defiant. So every time you go into Defiant, you see a Romulan there who's there to add sort of, and it would be great. We could have a Cardassian, and in season 4 we get Klingons, and then we have all these different aliens, Koi Ferengi. It would be interesting. It would be great addition to the melting pot to actually have a Romulan there. So I think this is a huge missed opportunity. I honestly don't see why they didn't make her a supporting character. I think that was a major mistake. Overall, the search, I liked the search. I think it was an interesting, exciting 2-parter. I think maybe the second part, where they had everything that was going on in the station turned out to be a fake out, where it was all inside their heads. I think that kind of downplayed the episode to me. Kind of made me feel like I was wasting my time a little bit. So I wouldn't say this is one of the best episodes ever, but it was still great. Like, the reveal with the changelings was amazing, and the whole storyline of them encountering the Jem'Hadar was very suspenseful. So an effective episode. Anyway, we'll get into the next episode, which is The House of Quark. And this was a surprisingly funny episode. I actually really enjoyed this episode. And I think Season 3 did a good job, mostly with Quark and Ferengi episodes, more so than most seasons, because the Ferengi episodes and Quark episodes are typically, I think, the weakest of the show, of each season, because they always have to include it. And this one gave a really interesting spin, because it's Quark being involved with Klingons, because he thinks he can take advantage of this Klingon dying in this bar, and saying that he defeat him in battle, and that comes back to bite him in the ass when the widow of that Klingon comes and marries him, mainly so she can gain power back with their house, with this other Klingon's trying to take her power away from her. So that was an interesting dynamic, and the interplay between Quark and Grilka was actually really interesting and funny at times. I think they had really good chemistry that worked. And it was also interesting contrasting the difference between Klingons and Ferengi, because this is something that's often brought up. It was mentioned a lot in Next Generation and stuff, is that Klingons hate Ferengi because they see them as the most weakly, cowardly kind of race. So Worf would often throw this around, or other Klingons would throw this around as a casual insult. Oh, you're going to act like a pack of Ferengi? That's like the biggest insult you could think of. But what's interesting is that earlier in Deep Space Nine, I think in the episode The Nagus, Zek was throwing around calling other Ferengi Klingons as an insult. It's like, oh, you guys are so dumb, you don't listen to me. It's like talking to a Klingon. So it's interesting that these two races are so opposite, so opposed, and so they have this natural hatred of each other because each of them stand for totally different things. So fascinating to get Quark becoming the head of a Klingon house, and just seeing Gowron in there going, the House of Quark, and he's like, Quark, the House of Quark, and just the look on his face, like the actors played this all really well. The one thing I will say though is, I didn't really buy. I did just want to have a Galron cameo because I didn't really buy that this situation with Grilka in their house was that important to warrant the attention of the leader of the entire Klingon freaking empire. That part was a bit hard to buy, but I did love when Quark was trying to prove that the other Klingon dude was, attacking Grilka's house financially and had all the little pads trying to go through all the different financial forms. And he was talking, if you go to pad A, section Y, whatever, and you see Galron just staring at this tiny pad and he goes like, enough! Gotta admit, that was funny. So, I mean, not the best episode ever, but it was very effective for a comedic Ferengi Quark episode. I think it really worked. Anyway, next episode is Equilibrium. This episode, it was fine. I mean, it was okay. I didn't have any major issues with it, but it wasn't all that interesting either. It was kind of really bland. It's about Dax. I don't know. I don't think Deep Space Nine handled the Trill the best. And in this episode, they seem to establish what the Trills are all about in seasons 1 and 2. And this episode kind of rewrites that because it tries to take the wool out from your eyes and say, what we said before about how rare it was for hosts and symbionts to find a match, that's actually all a lie. Any old host can join the symbiont. They're just keeping that under wraps because it would destroy their society to do so. I think that's kind of dumb. I think that's an obvious retcon. They obviously didn't think of that in seasons 1 and 2, and I think it undermines what they established with the Trill. That being said, it does work for the particular story in this episode, though, because it does. I did like the intrigue aspect of the episode that Dax is almost dying and she's going through this trauma, and it's all because of the Symbios Commission wants to cover up something they think would destroy their society. And I love how Sisko uncovers this and puts it in their face, and it's like, well, look, if you save Dax's life, I promise we won't tell anyone, we'll keep your secret. But if she dies, I'm telling everyone your secret. So I love that. That was a great Sisko moment, and overall, I love the way that Sisko and Bashir were sort of sticking up for Dax and bonded with her in this episode. I thought worked. What I didn't think worked was the beginning part of the episode where before they knew what was wrong and Jadzia was starting to be all pissy, like she was playing chess with Sisko, and he was like, oh, you're cheating, and then Kira went to talk to her. She's like, go away. That was very poorly acted. I'm sorry, it was. And it was poorly written as well. I didn't buy that Jadzia would act that way. It felt really forced and faked. So I don't know. I didn't hate this episode, but it wasn't that good either. It was okay. Anyway, next episode is Second Skin. And this is a really interesting character study with Major Kira thinking that she's Cardassian. I think it made her really question everything, especially when at first she's like, oh, you guys are crazy, there's no way I'm Cardassian, but then they get more and more evidence and it's making her question the reality. But it does turn out she is in fact Cardassian. Now, I heard some people criticize this episode for that, saying it would be more powerful if they revealed she actually was Cardassian, but I am so incredibly glad that they didn't. I think that would be retconning and at its worst. It would be a worse example of retconning. It would be like, really, you think that Kira, it would undermine, it would destroy her character. It would completely undermine all the growth every time we've seen her. I know it was kind of predictable that, oh, he's not a Cardassian after all. But I think they wrote themselves in the corner by having this situation where it's a lose-lose situation. Either you do this horrible retconning, or you do the predictable thing and say, oh, she's really not a Cardassian. And they went the predictable route, which really I think is the lesser of two evils. So I think they made the right choice here. I think, if I remember correctly, I think Ronald D. Moore, who had just joined the writing team for season 3, was one of the ones who wanted to make her a Cardassian permanently. Now, Ronald D. Moore, praised a lot on my channel. I think he's a great writer. He improved like Deep Space Nine a lot. He was a really strong point of Next Generation. But there's a couple, but one in particular aspect of his writing that he tends to do, a tendency he tends to have, which I think is very bad. I think is a very negative part of his writing style, and that is he loves to retcon things. He was the co-showrunner for Battlestar Galactica, and without giving away spoilers for the new Battlestar Galactica that came out in the 2000s, he in the later seasons he did some really awful retconning, which a lot of people noticed completely inconsistent with earlier seasons, and. In the Deep Space Nine in Season 5, there will be a character who gets retconned pretty badly, which I was totally against, absolutely hated. I suspect Ronald D. Moore was involved in that. I'll get to that when I get to Season 5. But, so I think it makes sense that he wanted to do the same thing with Kira, and I'm glad that they overruled him. And he didn't get to do that because and also like with Voyager, there was this episode with Harry Kim to reveal he's an alien from the Delta Quadrant, but then at the end of the episode it's revealed that, oh, that was all a trick, he's not really an alien. Ronald D. Moore was saying, oh, it would have been better if they revealed that he was an alien. It wouldn't. It would have ruined his character. But anyway, enough of that. I'm just glad they dodged a bullet here. But so this episode was kind of interesting. I mean, the stuff with Kira, I mean, yeah, maybe a bit tired because you knew that she wasn't really Cardassian the whole time. But what made this episode great was Garrick. Garrick. I think Season 3 is when Garrick really comes into his own. I think this is the first time we see him. And I love, like, the interplay with him and Sisko in this episode was amazing, where Garrick doesn't want to go to Cardassia to help Kira, but Sisko blackmails him into it, and I love how he says, I'm not going to help you. If anything goes wrong, you're on your own. And Sisko's like, well, I do believe that is the first honest thing you've ever said to me. And he's like, how perceptive of you. Like, I love the interaction, and of course, once he's there, is amazing. And when he beams down to rescue Kira and sees her as a Cardassian, it's like, oh, Major, I've never seen you look so ravishing. Awesome Garrick moment. And of course he kills the Obsidian Order agent Intech. It's like, after he like vaporizes him, it's like, oh, it's a pity, I rather liked him. So it's absolutely great. Now the end of the episode with Gamora giving Kira fatherly advice and saying, oh, never trust Garrick. They're trying to like foreshadow like he's an evil dude, which I don't know, may or may not come into play. I don't know if they really stuck to it. It seemed like they were just they were really like upplaying the negative aspects of Garrick. And I like this because the fact that he's constantly having lunch with Bashir and he's getting chummy with all our main characters, you can forget that the dark side of him. So I love that they re-emphasize that. So I like this episode a lot, mainly for that. Anyway, let's move over to next episode, which is The Abandoned. So this is a pretty interesting character story for Odo, because he basically takes on a fatherly role. And I think the way that Odo advocates for it, so they find this Jem'Hadar baby who like very advanced, and Starfleet wants to send them off to like labs to get studied, and Odo's very much against that. From his own personal experiences in a lab, something that's studied in a lab, a laboratory subject, and he doesn't want this baby or this Jem'Hadar child to go through the same thing, so he takes him on as a mentor. And the Jem'Hadar, of course, is genetically created in order to see Odo and to obey Odo, to obey any changelings, and see them as I don't think they mention gods, actually. That's an aspect they'll bring up in later seasons, but he is like sees him as a superior. Although I will say there are a couple times where he disobeys Odo, or doesn't in fact follow him incredibly, which I would say is kind of inconsistent with how the Jem'Hadar are portrayed in later seasons. But hey, they're just developing them here. And I think this episode was great for it delved deeper into the Jem'Hadar, into the Dominion. It introduced things like Ketracel White, which makes a lot of sense in how the Jem'Hadar are genetically created. They're not like natural born, like they are genetically engineered soldiers that the founders created, and so they create all these aspects into them, like the need to fight. Although I will say they refuse to follow any other alien species other than the founders, which isn't actually true because they actually follow the Vorta, as we'll see later on. But again, they're just developing everything here. So I thought this was a really interesting episode. I thought it was a good character study for Odo, and the fact that Odo actually was kind of misguided because he was instinctively acting on his own hatred of his own past experience, but he was imposing it onto this Jem'Hadar where it didn't necessarily apply. So you actually find out that he was wrong, that he should have just let Sisko send him to Starfleet to be studied in the lab. So that was kind of interesting. It was kind of interesting seeing the Odo try to be this fatherly figure to the Jem'Hadar, but I don't know. Like, I still like this episode, but I think the ending kind of undercuts this episode, like the theme behind it. And I'm not quite sure what the message is, because it seems like the message is you shouldn't try to help someone, and killers will always be killers, and people are always, bad guys are bad guys, and that's a message I don't agree with. It's different here because the Jem'Hadar are genetically engineered, but I didn't think it quite worked. The fact that the Jem'Hadar actually refused any of Odo's teachings and totally rejected him and just wanted to go join the Dominion and kill people. That kind of disappointed me. I mean, it makes sense, but I don't think it's the provocative. It's not the powerful way to go. I think a much more powerful way to go would be like the Voyager episode Drone, where they encounter a Borg and they think he's going to turn out and want to be a Borg and kill people, but he actually is attached to 709 so much as a parent figure that he helps Voyager and joins the Voyager crew. So I actually think that would have been more interesting if the Jem'Hadar was attached to Odo more as a parental figure and wanted to join the Deep Space Nine crew, but imagine how fascinating it would be if they actually had a Jem'Hadar long-term supporting character who saw Odo as a father. That would be interesting, but nope. Gotta set that reset button, but again, I won't complain about it too much with Deep Space Nine because Deep Space Nine wasn't anywhere near as bad as Voyager was in that regard. But anyway, let's move over to the next episode, which is Civil Defense. I recently did a full-length review on this, so you can check that out if you want to see my full thoughts. But just kind of to recap what I said there. I love this episode. I love the fact that it reinforces that Deep Space Nine is of Cardassian origin. That's something you could forget, that the station they think of as home, the station they live at, was like this death camp used during the Bajoran occupation. And so it reinforces that with this computer program that totally takes over the station and puts everyone's lives at risk. Although I will say I don't really buy the computer program. It doesn't make sense that they would have a self-contained independent program to do something that Ducat and all the others, if they were still in charge of the station, could just do themselves. But whatever, it works for the episode. And I think this is a great disaster type episode. It's similar to the TNG episode Disaster. It's similar to the next season 4 episode Starship Down, and where it follows the typical format of a disaster movie, earthquake, whatever, what have you, where the people are broken up into different locations and they're stuck there because of a particular disaster. But it improves upon it. It gives you more than just a disaster story, because it's about a computer program actively trying to kill people, and the more they try to defeat the program, the worse things get and the worse people, because at first it was just Cisco, Brian, and Jake who were at risk, and then after they got out, then it put the entire promenade at risk, and then they tried to fight against that, and then it put the entire station at risk. So I love that. I love the escalating tension and how everything that seems to get worse. And of course, Garrick and Ducat were absolutely amazing in this episode, particularly Ducat. I love the way they used Ducat in this episode, as he was all arrogant, up himself, and then of course when he tries to extort Kira and then beam away, the program shoots him down as well. That was an amazing moment, one of the best of the show. Absolutely love the use of Garrick and Ducat in this episode. Now, Quark and Odo, I love their interactions usually, but in this episode it probably wasn't at its best. It was kind of the weak part of the episode because it was kind of isolated with just two of them in the room talking, where I wanted to see all the action going on. But yeah, and the ending of the episode wasn't the best. It kind of ended a bit too easily, but it wasn't that bad. Overall, I'd still say this is a really good episode, one of my favorites. Anyway, we'll move over to the next episode, which is not one of my favorites, and that is Mirrodin. So this was a typical boring Romance of the Week episode. They fly. It's something that Deep Space Nine didn't do that much, and it's more of a Next Generation Voyager thing. It's a shame to see Deep Space Nine doing that. They fly to a planet. A member of the crew falls in love with someone there, and they have to say, "Oh, let's be together," and something happens, and they have to leave. Those episodes never work because you don't have enough time to build the romance, and so you never buy the romance. This episode in particular was really bad because they wanted to jump to the part of Jadzia and this dude, whatever his name is, trying to find a way to be together. So they had to rush the fact that they were falling in love. So it seems like a fling, and you don't buy. You completely do not buy that these two people want to spend the rest of their lives together, that Jadzia would make a life-changing decision to go into this planet that disappears for 60 years, and so she would lose all of her friends, everything she knows, just for this one dude she just met. Totally unbelievable. Completely doesn't work. But, you know what? I'm watching this episode for the first time in years, right after I watched Season 2 of Lost, because I did my review of the first 8 episodes of Season 2 of Lost, and I just noticed for the first time that the dude in this episode, the Romance of the Week guy, is Goodwin from Lost. If you've seen Lost, you know Goodwin. He was from the Others, who was implanted with the tail section survivors. That's him. And I'm like, shit. I totally didn't realize that was Goodwin. I think he has that, oh, I'm a handsome man type look to him, so it kind of makes sense. But anyway. And, the plot of the episode otherwise was the technobabble nonsense about the disappearing planet. Blah, 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 blah. Who cares? The only thing that saves this episode from not completely sucking and not being one of the worst episodes is the B story, which is actually quite good. I was surprised. So the B story was about this guy played by Jeffrey Combs, who has a thing for Kira, but Kira totally rejects him. So he goes to Quark and says, build me a holosuite program around Kira. So basically so he can have sex with a hologram version of Kira. And so Quark goes around trying to get Kira's hologram. He tries to trick her with prizes, and that doesn't work. So he tries to take a holographic image of her with a camera, and that doesn't work. And so finally he steals her information. Now, this was a really interesting side plot because it's kind of more culturally relevant today than it was when it came out. Because today you have a lot of issues on the internet. Like just recently, there's a thing with, I can't remember exactly what it's called, but it's this thing with the kind of porn where they superimpose like a celebrity's face onto a porn actress's face to make it look like the celebrity is having sex. And some of these celebrities, not surprisingly, are suing these companies and trying to get these videos taken down because the way they use computer graphics, it's not just fake Photoshop. It actually uses like computer imaging to make it look realistic, and so it looks like the celebrity is having sex with someone. So obviously, a lot of celebrities are against this, and also leaking of celebrity nudes and stuff like that, and how what the interest rates between privacy and how wrong it is for them. In fact, it's a bit weird seeing this episode play that kind of story for laughs and be quite light with it, because it seems like nowadays it would be more of a heavy topic. So it was kind of interesting that this episode was kind of predictive of that. And of course, it completely takes Kira's side because she's completely against that. Now, if she consented to it, that would be something else, but she was outright refused. Quark, even though Quark tried to lie and say like, oh, they just want to go out and play and be on the ops decks and pretend they're part of the crew. It's kind of funny though the way Odo and Kira is like, oh, naked, I suppose. And you have a lot of good character interactions between Odo, Kira, and Quark, which are funny. You get funny moments, and this storyline that's about Quark basically being a creep in the worst regard. But of course, it's all good because Quark gets his comeuppance in the end, where they superimpose Quark's head onto what was supposed to be Kira's head, and so the other guy was so, ran out upset and said he was going to ruin Quark. Of course, we never hear about this again. This rich guy who's like apparently filthy rich says he's going to ruin Quark, but we never actually see him do anything of the sort. So whatever, continuity, whatever. But it was still an interesting story, so it saves the episode from totally sucking. So it just kind of sucks. Anyway, next episode is the Defiant, where we get to see Will Riker, or not Will Riker, but we get to see Riker, a former Riker, on Deep Space Nine. Jonathan Frakes playing Riker, which is kind of interesting. This did come out shortly before Generations came out, so some people may say it's like a promotional, kind of the same way Leonard Nimoy appearing on Next Generation was promotional for Star Trek 6. Maybe. It might have been. They never really specified that, but it kind of makes sense. Although, he talked about Dr. Crusher forcing him to go on shore leave from the Enterprise, but the Enterprise was destroyed in Generations, so I guess we're supposed to believe this was shortly before Generations. But, it doesn't really matter because it's not actually Commander Riker. It's not Will Riker. It's Lieutenant Tom Riker, the duplicate we met in the episode Second Chances from TNG. And I love the follow-up to that. I love that they take this obscure reference from this one episode of the sixth season of Next Generation and integrate it into Deep Space Nine. But it's a way for them to have their cake and eat it too. It's because they can have Riker join the Maquis and steal the Defiant, but not actually have it Riker, so they don't have to mess with the TNG continuity. So it's it is a way for them to have their cake and eat it too. Now, do I think this episode works? Yeah, it was okay. It was interesting. I don't think it was the best. The Riker aspect did seem a bit gimmicky. It's like, oh, come watch the show, TNG fans. Here's Riker, but on the other hand, I did like his interactions with Kira and Dax and all that. I did think it was interesting, the romance between them. I kind of thought it was interesting seeing those two interact. But some downsides of the episode was, in contrast to Civil Defense, I did not like the way Dukat was portrayed in this episode. He was portrayed as way too chummy with Sisko, someone who all of a sudden was all interested in peace. He's almost played as the good guy. I'm never really a fan of when they portray Dukat as the good guy. I think he works a lot better as a villain. I think because he's been established to be this really despicable, guy who's in charge of all these atrocities of killing thousands of Bajorans. So I don't want to identify with him. I don't want to be worry about him missing his son's birthday. Who gives a fuck about this? He's a mass murderer. Anyway, but I also didn't really like Kira's preaching to Riker about how, oh, you're trying to be a terrorist, you have to go out and kill people, and terrorists are bad, and when I was a terrorist I would kill a lot of people, you just want to be a hero, blah blah blah. I actually totally disagree with her. I actually agree with Tom. I think he actually had the right decision, that if he just went around killing people, that would have made things worse for the demilitarized zone. But he had a specific mission to go out and try to stop what he thought. Of course, he had bad intelligence, but if he was correct and stop these specific people that were arming the Cardassians in the demilitarized zone, then I think he was doing the right thing. I totally agree with this mission. I think Kira's wrong. And all this stuff about, oh, you just want to differentiate yourself from the other Riker, you don't care, blah, 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 blah. Shut up, Kira, you're wrong. Anyway, that's just me. I know other people may disagree. But here's the thing. This episode kind of foreshadowed what happens towards the end of the season in Improbable Calls in the Dice cast, because they go into the Rias sector, I think as they call it, because that's where Tom thinks all the shady activity is going on, but he's actually incorrect. It has nothing to do with the demilitarized zone, because when they try to go, they see these Cardassian ships just appear out of nowhere and block his way, and they seem to be controlled by the Obsidian Order, which Dukat points out they're not supposed to have ships, but the Obsidian Order woman just gives an evil smile, and I guess that makes everything okay. I don't know why Dukat didn't press that more, but anyway, so it's setting up for the Dias cast, because we find out in that two-parter later on that the Obsidian Order and the Tal Shiar had joined forces to build a fleet to go into the Gamma Quadrant to wipe out the Founders, so they could get rid of the Dominion threat. So that's why they're Cardassian ships controlled by the Obsidian Order with cloaking devices, because they get cloaking devices from the Romulans. And I think I heard that they didn't actually know that when they wrote this episode. So I think that's actually brilliant how perfectly that matches up. The one thing I don't think makes any sense is the episode ends with Dukat making a deal with Tom Riker that he'll let his crew live and he'll just give him a life sentence, which, by the way, I think death would probably be preferable to a life sentence in a Cardassian labor camp, just my opinion. But anyway, then Dukat makes a deal with Tom for the logs, the sensor logs of the Arias sector. And so if Dukat got these sensor logs of the Arias sector, why didn't he learn about it? It seemed like those logs were completely worthless because he didn't learn about what the Obsidian Order was doing in any way, shape, or form. He didn't manage to stop them. They were completely surprised. Although, I suppose some fansplaining here, you could say he did learn about them, but decided was all on board with it. And so it's like, okay, you guys do what you want. And it just gives us plausible deniability, so the Central Command can just be like, oh, we didn't know anything about this. Really, they did know, but they liked it. So I guess you could explain it there, but it's still, I don't know. It could have been tied up a little bit better. Those logs seemed worthless. Also, the ending where Tom Riker is, he goes to prison and Kira says, we'll get you out, but she doesn't. It seems like she's a liar because there's no follow-up to this whatsoever. And apparently I heard somewhere, I don't know if this is true, but I heard somewhere in the writing room for season 4, the producers particularly shot down any idea involving Thomas Riker. They were 100% against Thomas Riker reappearing. Why? You set it up at the end of this episode for reappearance. You particularly laid a breadcrumb. You gave a cliffhanger. Here, he's going to reappear, and he never does. I think that was dumb. There's a lot of non-canon material that says whatever happened to Thomas Riker. I think there's 2 examples I can think of. I think that William Shatner one, that book he wrote with William Shatner coming back to life and becoming a Borg. I think that involved Thomas Riker. I can't remember. But I know Peter David made this book, Imzadi 2, which is a sequel to his popular book, Imzadi, that showed Thomas Riker escaping from prison and then going off after Deanna Troi and being kind of like a villain stalker type thing, which I didn't really care for. I don't think Thomas Riker is a villain stalker type character. But I would like to think that he broke out of prison, because I feel bad for him. He spent 8 years on this planet. He finally gets out, and then a couple years later, he gets put into a Cardassian labor camp. Quite tragic. But anyway, let's move over to the next episode, which is Fascination. So this is a horrible Waxin and Troy episode, which I don't like her. I mean, she's okay sometimes in Next Generation, but I never liked her in Deep Space Nine. She's just like being really creepy to Odo all the time, just following him around. And there's a Bajoran gratitude festival, which I think the concept of it is kind of interesting, exploring Bajoran culture more and having them have a festival, and just so it has the different aspects, because we're told a lot that the Bajoran are really artistic and spiritual people, but we don't see it. Particularly the artistic side, we don't see it that much, so it's good to explore that and see the artsy side of them. But the episode itself is horrible, and I can't understate that, because it's about basically the Waxin and Troy. She has some disease or something, so every time she gets sick, someone around her gets the feeling that she has, and at the moment she's totally in love with Otis, so everyone starts being in love with someone. So this episode is basically, I think it's a really outdated episode. I don't think it holds up to modern society, because it's basically really creepy. It's about these people, because they're being controlled by this telepathy, they just really creepily stalk, and sometimes they physically touch and just creep on this other person that they apparently have a dormant crush on, which is the whole thing again is stupid. You get Jake going around being, oh, where's Kira? I love you, Kira. And then Bareil is there, and he starts creeping on Jadzia. It's like, oh, Jadzia, I love you. And then Jadzia starts creeping on Sisko, and then at the end, Quark just assaults frickin' Keiko and starts creeping on her. It's not only is it's just a bad episode. It's silly, it's over the top, it's cartoonish, and it's dumb. I just don't buy any of the behavior. It just comes off as a cartoon. It's not funny. It is stupid. But the only saving grace of this episode is the O'Brien and Keiko scenes. I actually really like those. I know I've heard a lot of criticism against the O'Brien and Keiko relationship, which I can kind of understand, because it can come off as annoying, and some other episodes in particular they do come off as a bit annoying. But this episode in particular, I actually think it really works. And as someone who was married at one point, I could really relate that this is what it's like to be in a marriage. It seemed like a very realistic portrayal, the ups and downs, how they had to compromise, and how O'Brien was just lost his temper because he couldn't stand the fact that Keiko was away from him for so long. Totally made sense, and I think the way it was portrayed in this episode, and how they sort of fought and they made up at the end, I think it was a great love story. So I think this saves this episode from being one of the worst of the series. But the rest of the episode was just crap. So anyway, let's get into the next episode, which is Past Tense. Another one of my favorite episodes of Deep Space Nine. It's a very unique episode in the catalog of Deep Space Nine. I also did a full-length review of this if you want to check that out. But again, to summarize my thoughts, I love the preachiness. Some people complain, oh, Star Trek can be too preachy sometimes. I think if it's preachy in the right way, like Let That Be Your Last Battlefield and this, I think it works. I think this social commentary, and again, it's even more relevant today than it was when this episode came out, about the treatment of the homeless and how they're disregarded and they want to shuffle them off and demonize them, basically. Very relevant today. And I think the way this episode handles this is amazing. And it has an ensemble cast, a lot of guest stars and interesting characters like BC, Webb, that Chris guy that Dax gets, that she hooks up with, sort of. Like all these characters are really well acted. For one thing, it's not typical that Star Trek will have good guest actors, but they're all well acted, they're well developed. You totally buy them. It has that one dude from Gremlins who's being all grumpy, who really works in that role. You get the interactions between Sisko trying to save them and pretending to be Gabriel Bell. That was amazing. And also, like, the whole interactions between Sisko and Bashir in this episode, like, I think you're really starting to normalize Bashir and really develop him. And I love how, because we never get that much of just seeing Sisko and Bashir together. So it's great to get their interactions, to see them as a team in this episode. I think it makes it a very unique episode of Deep Space Nine. And also, like, the whole time travel aspect of how the whole two-parter basically takes place in the year 2024 on Earth really sets it apart from any other Deep Space Nine episode. So I think this episode really stands out. It has a funny side plot with O'Brien and Kira going back in time to try to find them, especially that thing when they end up in the 60s with the hippies. That was hilarious. One of the funniest parts of the show. One drawback of this episode, though, is that it has really bad time travel logic. The time travel logic was horrendous. I won't get into this now. You can watch my full review if you want me to get more into it. But it's just some of the worst time travel logic I've ever seen. But I'm willing to overlook that because the actual episode, the plot of the episode, the meat of it, the stories, the commentary, the characters were all top-notch. Really great episode. Anyway, next episode is a life support. I've heard a lot of people put this episode down, which I gotta be honest here, I always liked this episode. I remember watching this episode maybe, not when I first saw it, but maybe like 5 or 8 years ago, and totally blown away by it, and engrossed. I think, in particular, like the ending, I thought was very touching. It was really emotionally effective romance episode, basically. I named this when I did my top 10 romance Star Trek episodes. This was in it because I think this is really effective. It was a really tragic story of Kira losing the man she loves, and the ending where she's like just holding his hand and telling the story of how they first met, like, that brought a tear to my eye. That was really effective. And I think it was a great use of Bareil, too, because, let's be honest, Bareil, not the best character, particularly in the last episode he appeared in Fascination. It was obvious the writers didn't know how to use him properly, so I think killing him off, right thing to do. I think not only was killing him off the right thing to do, but the way they killed him off actually really worked. It worked for Kira's story, it worked for the episode, and it made them go out on a high point, which is what you always want to do for characters who aren't working. Also, I think this is a great use of Kai Wen and how despicable she is. I love how it's not in your face as some of her other appearances is. So at first she appears to be wanting to do the right thing, wanting to make peace with Cardassia, but of course you slowly learn that she's just doing this to grab power, and she's using Bareil and basically and then discarding him after she doesn't need him anymore. I love that aspect of the episode. I think it was great. It's also a really good Bashir episode, again getting into the medical drama aspect of it, where he's trying to save his life, save Bareil's life, and then something keeps going wrong, and he's warning people, let me put him in stasis because something else is going to go wrong, but they don't listen to him, and sure enough, something else goes wrong, and it finally gets to the point where Kira wants his entire brain replaced by an artificial brain, and Bashir is like, no, I'm not going to do it because he's not going to be Bareil anymore. It would just be a cheap imitation. Leave me out of it. It was really powerful. I actually liked this. I don't think it's one of the best episodes ever because it wasn't as fascinating as some of the good episodes, but I did really enjoy it. I did think it was a good episode. Anyway, we get into the next episode, which is Heart of Stone, which I also thought, it's not the best, but it was a fairly interesting episode. It was a good Kira and Odo character story. I like the interactions between the two, where Kira's like, and the trapped in the stone, Odo's trying to get her, or the crystal, and Odo's trying to get her out, but can't. Although we find out it's not really Kira, it was still interesting Odo and Kira interaction, and the fact that it's not really Kira makes it more interesting, because especially watching it on repeat viewings when you know that it's the female changeling who's pretending to be Kira, because there are some tells, there are some giveaways that she doesn't, she's just emulating how she thinks Kira would react, and sometimes she gets it wrong. And it was fascinating seeing Odo put it together. Now, of course, the big revelation of this episode is that Odo is in love with Kira, and that's something that's kind of been hinted at throughout season 3. There's been a lot of small little drops, and Kira, of course, is oblivious to it, which is realistic because most people are oblivious when a friend of theirs is crushing on them. But they finally make it clear. They spell it out to solidify it that Odo is in love with Kira, which, yeah, I love the iteration. I love how Kira saying "I love you too" was a giveaway that she was lying. Although I don't necessarily agree with the reasoning this episode states that Kira definitely doesn't love Odo, and so Odo knows that it's not really Kira. Whatever. I don't know. But it was still interesting. And the side plot with Nog wanting to join Starfleet was really good. It was a really interesting character study for Nog. How everyone didn't believe him. They thought he was up to something. They thought he was scheming or lying. So they were trying to get it out. Why do you want to join? And he keeps insisting, "No, I'm not lying. I'm not scheming. I really want to join Starfleet." And you finally get it out of him at the end of the episode. Cisco finally gets it out of him. It's because his father is an engineering genius, but he's being discarded and used as a piece of shit because he's trying to be good for Ferengi, and so Nog doesn't want to end up like his father, which I think is good. It was a good story, but I have some issues with it. First of all, that retconning I was talking about of characters, this is probably a light version of that, because it's not a rough retconning as bad as saying making Kira a Cardassian or making Bashir genetically engineered. It's not as bad and redefining as that, but it's kind of a light version of that, because from here on out, because Nog acts like Nog in this episode. Like the first 2 or 3 seasons, we see Nog, he's this despicable, I'm gonna her. And he's still like that in this episode, but from now on, like, especially getting into the 4th and 5th season, he becomes a totally different character. Now, some people could argue, well, that's just teenagers growing up, they become totally different people as you age. Yeah, maybe. I think it does it to too much of an extreme, which I don't really buy. But it's not that bad. As I say, it's a light version. I think the worst retconning here is with Rom, because he was portrayed as a flat-out idiot. I just watched seasons 1 and 2. If you just watch seasons 1 and 2, he's not an engineering genius. He's just a plain idiot. In fact, there's some episodes in the first season that specifically point to the fact that his engineering skills suck. So they're definitely retconning Rom's character here, but I think it's for the good. Because I think the characters are better from now on, and they use them in more interesting ways. So again, I don't kind of mixed on it because I'm against the retconning, but it's ultimately done for good, so I'll let it slide. Anyway, next episode is Destiny, which is another episode I've seen get a lot of flack for. I don't think it's the best. It's not one of my favorite episodes by any means, but it's okay. I actually enjoyed this episode. I think it's an interesting look at Cardassian culture. You get 3 Cardassian female scientists. You haven't really typically seen that many Cardassian women on the show before. Although that awful episode Prophet and Lost in season 2, but let's not get into that. This, I think, was more interesting. It's also not just Cardassian women, but Cardassian civilians, Cardassian scientists who are different apart from the military. And it was very interesting getting that different, because most look into Cardassian culture, we get into people like Goldu Kott, who's like a military man, or Garrick, who is a patriot, like spy type people. So it's interesting seeing a different, like the civilian who don't necessarily agree with their oppressive government and is more like just regular people and how they like to eat off-world food and stuff like that. And of course, this is contrasted by the third scientist who shows up, who of course isn't a scientist at all, but a member of the Obsidian Order, which I think they telegraph maybe a bit too much, because it's a bit too obvious that she's really against the scientists being all preppy and scientisty. But I think it works. And also, I like the way it plays with Bajoran prophecy, actually, in this episode. It makes an interesting commentary on prophecy and how it can be interpreted in many ways. But of course, in the world of Deep Space Nine, the prophets, the wormhole aliens, actually do exist outside of linear time. And I think Kira even makes this point to Sisko, and has a scientific point that actually makes a lot of sense, that they can actually see the future because they exist outside of linear time. So it's not outside the realm of possibility that they communicated this to a Bajoran on Bajor and saw the future. And of course, as we see later in the show, they take this and really run with this. And so this is sort of setting up for that. And so it is interesting, but they totally misinterpreted this prophecy at first to make it think that Cardassians would destroy the wormhole, but it actually turns out that the series of events calls the wormhole to be even more conductive for communication. So that was interesting. And of course, this explores like Sisko as the emissary and what that means. Something that I think the show has been really lacking and running away from, because for the most part, up until now, emissary is only ever mentioned when like a Bajoran religious figure comes on board and calls him emissary, and that's about it. So it's kind of implying that Sisko is a religious figure in the Bajoran religion called the emissary, but never delves deep into what that means. How does Sisko take being looked on as a religious figure? How does Kira look on working for a religious figure? And I love how we finally get the touch on that, where Kira says, yes, I do see you as the emissary. I know that you hate that, but I can't help it. And Sisko starts to come to terms with what that means and start to accept that more, because I love how the episode ends with him going off with Vedic and asking about more of the prophecies and not running away from that, which I love that, that's how he would react at first, is to want to run away from it. So I love that this episode explores that, and in fact I think it does it a lot better than some of the episodes in future seasons do personally. So I actually really like this episode. Alright, next episode we get is Prophet Motive. And again, another example of Season 3 doing Ferengi episodes good. I think the Ferengi episodes in Season 3 are better than most other seasons. Typically. I think this isn't the best Ferengi episode that will come in Season 6, but I think this is the best Zek episode. The best use of Zek coming on board. I just think this episode's hilarious. Now, doesn't really have a deep meaning or strong theme or anything like that, but it's got a lot of good character interactions. It's got a lot of humor that works, like the chemistry between Rom and Quark really comes off in this episode, where it doesn't as much in other episodes, and the chemistry with Zek as well. I mean, it's just a funny episode how Zek comes on and tries to rewrite the rules of acquisition for Ferengi to be all nice to each other. And I had to quote this, one of my favorite quotes of the show. I quote all myself to my time when Rom is quoting Zek to Quark, and he said, "Rom, now's the time Ferengi had to move beyond greed." And Quark's like, "What do you mean beyond greed? There's nothing beyond greed." It's just, I love that. And of course, it's a very interesting plot twist when you find out it was the wormhole aliens that Zek tried to go to them to seek profit, and the wormhole aliens ended up changing him so that he'd be good for Ferengi. Interesting use of the prophets, although I will say, when I first saw this episode, I was really pissed off that this was the first recurrence of the wormhole aliens since the very first pilot episode. So I've been waiting years to see them, and we finally get to see them again, and it's a stupid Ferengi episode. I'm like, oh, really? But I'm kind of more okay with it now, looking back at it in retrospect, because I know that they'll be used a lot more in the future. So I'm okay with it now, but when I first saw it, I was kind of peeved about that. But looking back on it now that I know that the wormhole aliens will get their due later on, I think this was an interesting use of them. It was a very unconventional use of them that subverts expectations, and I liked it, and I think it was a funny episode. So anyway, let's move on to the next episode, which is Visionary. This is another episode I did a full-length review for. You can check out if you'd like. Another one of my favorite episodes. Love this episode. It's a great time-traveling episode. It's one of my favorite uses of time travel. Instead of like, oh, let's travel back to 1990 whenever this episode's airing and have them go around and act like it is Voyager did this. Anyway, not getting into that. Instead of doing stuff like that, it's he's time traveling by 5 hours into the future, so he sees a glimpse and how that affects it. Just I love like when they do weird stuff like the 5-hour time jump, and how now it's kind of coincidence that every time he jumps something significant happens. He sees himself dying like 3 times, but it's still good. I love the way, and I love using O'Brien has the center for the character to do this. Because he's like the everyman, and again, this episode in particular, I think, is probably my favorite as far as character interactions go. This is where I think the writers and the actors and everyone really got a handle of all their characters, because they really gelled, like the humor, the interactions between them, like O'Brien and Bashir, the way they related to each other was just top notch, and like Odo and Cisco, like some of the scenes like with Cisco saying Odo saying he's going to investigate the Bajorans, the Klingons, the Cardassians, and Quark, and Cisco's like, what, you think Quark had something to do with this? He's like, I always investigate Quark. Like, and that's just one example. There's a lot of great examples between just the character interactions gel, that combined with a very fascinating. Now I've heard some time travel story. Now I heard some complaints of people saying, oh, it's too Next Generation like to have a time travel episode. Bollocks. I think this episode is full on Deep Space Nine. As I said, it feels like the most Deep Space Nine as far as the character interactions go. It really explores these characters, and plus I love interesting time travel episodes regardless of the setting, and I think this one was pulled off really well. Also, as I said, this is like another great example of, even though the Dominion's not in this episode, their presence is ever looming, and I love how we get the follow-up from the Romulans that we see in the Search, that they actually come back to the station, and they want their payback, they want their information, and I love how the Romulans actually want to blow up the station because of the Dominion threat, and that makes total sense. In fact, I said this in my full-length review, the Romulans weren't necessarily wrong in wanting to collapse the wormhole. Think of how many lives would have been saved if they did, but not getting into that. Anyway, great episode. Absolutely loved it. So, we'll get into Distant Voices, which is not a great episode. It is probably, I would say, one of the worst of the show. It's a very poor use of going inside someone's head. Now, that's always a problematic story to do, because when you're in someone's head, it's hard to visualize that. And if you imagine like what it would be like to go into your own thoughts, your thoughts are very disjointed, very broken up, all over the place. That's not what this episode is at all. It's very straightforward. Oh, Kira's my anger, and Odo's my suspicion, O'Brien's my doubt, and it's just so silly. It's the metaphors were awful. It didn't work. The dialogue was so cringeworthy. Oh my god! And it's having like the Leftian being the villain. You can't stop it, Doctor. It's just, and the makeup was awful. Anyone else notice how they they made Bashir, when they put the old man makeup on him, they just made him look like Malcolm McDowell. Now, I think Malcolm McDowell's his uncle in real life, the actor who plays Bashir. So maybe that's why they did it, but I just think I don't know. I just think it's silly. His acting was really bad as an old man. Oh, you Garrick, rah, rah. It was just painful. Very painful to watch this episode. It is very poorly constructed. It was a misuse of Garrick, by the way, by just having Garrick morph into the villain. But again, the only saving grace I will say about this episode is the coda, the start of the episode and the end, that has the lunch scenes with Garrick having lunch with Bashir, because it normalizes Bashir and Garrick having lunch, and it makes it a staple part of the show. Which I know we've seen it from time to time in the first 2 seasons, but they're really hitting home with it now. And they had some really good interactions, actually, in those 2 scenes. So that's the only saving grace of the episode, but it still sucks a lot. Anyway, getting into the next episode, which is Through the Looking Glass. Now, this episode was okay. It was fine. I mean, this is the first time we revisit the Mirror Universe since it was first established in the episode Crossover. Now, if you've seen my review of Season 2 or my review of Crossover, you know that I loved Crossover. I thought it was one of my favorite episodes. This episode, not so much. I think this episode lost a lot of what made Crossover so good. Part of it was having the focus on different characters like Kira and Bashir, and also having these characters trapped in the place they can't get out of. And also you had Kira had to confront like the evil side of her, who was basically like a version of Dukat, and to find out that she could have been Dukat, her worst enemy, was a very interesting character study. And in this episode, you don't really get anything like that. You just have Kira being the attendant, like just hamming up the scene, and it focuses on Cisco, which honestly I think makes it a bit more bland. I do like the fact that they introduce a lot more characters, like you see the Mirror Bashir and the Mirror Ram and the Mirror Dax, and they in fact include a cameo by Tuvok. I often forget about that. It's all because it's so like behind the scenes, because they don't make a big deal about it. But this is during Voyager's first season, so they're wanting to promote Voyager. And I'm sure they're like, oh, we need to have a cameo of a Voyager character on Deep Space Nine, but they're saying like, well, that's impossible because Voyager's on the other side of the galaxy. So when they came up with the Mirror Universe, they're like, aha, here's a way we can do it. But he didn't appear in it that much, so it's kind of just like, oh, there's Tuvok. So yeah, I mean, it was okay. I think the concept of having the Cisco wanting to save Jennifer and having like his wife who had died in his timeline, and he has to go into another universe where she's still alive, but his counterpart's dead, so he pretends to be him, and how she's very hesitant against him, and he's basically trying to save her life. And you can tell, I think Avery Brooks, I'm not always a big fan of his acting, but I think he does an amazing job here in portraying how the inner conflict within Cisco and how badly he wants to save Jennifer, even though he knows it's not his wife, but it kind of is in a sense. So he has this like deep desire, but at the same time he's trying to hide this from her. And at the end, of course, she figures it out. She can see through, because she can tell that her actual husband's an asshole, and in this version of Cisco's a nice guy. So that kind of worked. I did like that, although I don't think they focused on that enough, and I don't think it was enough to save the episode, which was kind of resolved a bit too easily. Like the main plot of them being trapped on Deep Space Nine and escaping or whatever, wasn't that into. So I mean, it was okay. It was a fairly good episode, not the best. Anyway, next we get into Improbable Calls and the Dias Cast. I will talk about them both together because it's a two-parter. Although I will say up front, I did prefer Improbable Calls to the Dias Cast. But still, I'm going to talk about them both at the same time. And again, I've done a full-length review for these two-parter if you want to check it out. But anyway, I love this two-parter. It's some of my favorite episodes of Deep Space Nine, because this is Garrick at his absolute best. This is really, really solidified Garrick's character and his dialogue, his interactions with Odo, his interactions with Bashir, his interactions with Sisko. Like, I did this one video where I said like my favorite Garrick moments, and I think like 3 of them were from these two-parter. I probably could have like 5 from this two-parter. He has so many great quotes, and improbable calls alone, actually, to be fair. and it was just such a good use of Garrick, and as I said, it illustrating that he's just not the normal, because he basically becomes a villain in the second part. And so it's illustrating that he's not your chummy good guy you just have lunch with, that there's a lot more texture to him, and that is so fascinating to explore. Also like how this two-parter treats Odo, because you really get inside of Odo's investigating motives, something that they never did for Tuvok on Voyager, by the way, but don't want to get too off track. And they don't do that much for Odo and Deep Space Nine, too, to be honest. Like, Necessary Evil is another episode that comes to mind that did this previously, but usually they don't get too much into it. And the way they do it here, I think, is great. I love how he's able to see through Garrick's lies. He's able to figure out that he blew up his own shop. That was an amazing moment. Also, I love the scene where Odo goes to his Cardassian contact, who's like in this cavern and he's in the dark kind of above him, because you always hear Odo talking about, I have a contact in Cardassia, I have a contact in Starfleet, but here you get to see him in this shadowy like interchange they have, where he's kind of speaking in riddles, he's in the shadows. I love that. That was great. But what was even more amazing is the way that these two-parter, like, it plays with the political landscape of Star Trek, something I think up to now Star Trek has been too cowardly to do. They kind of touch on things, there's a Klingon civil war, Romulans interfering, blah, 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 but they just wipe the whole entire political landscape, where you makes you think the Romulans are going to war with the Cardassians, but you find out that the Romulans and Cardassians, or the Tal Shiar and Obsidian Order, who are similar organizations, are teaming up to wipe out the Founders, and they go into the Gamma Quadrant on a mission to just wipe them all out. That was fascinating, and of course they're ambushed and they all die. Amazing twists and turns. I love the way they play with the political landscape. Also, Nabarn Tain, for he had one brief appearance in season 2 episode The Wire, which I said it was a great introduction to this character, so it made total sense to bring him back. He was also amazing in this episode. It was great seeing his interactions between Garrick and the relationship that they have together, and the way he was used in this episode, especially his death scene at the end, where he's just sitting on the bridge refusing to leave, and Odo has to knock Garrick out to get him to go. That was great. And of course we get another big changeling reveal in this episode, where they reveal that the Romulan leader of the Tal Shiar, Colonel Lovak, was actually a changeling, and that they set this whole thing up as a trap. It again drives home that the Dominion aren't just like a powerful space force. It's not just the Jem'Hadar. It's not just a fighting force and great ships that can destroy you. Is that they have the most expert espionage you could possibly have, by having shapeshifters pretending to be, and not only learning, like spying and learning information about them, but planting information and deceiving them, which will be touched on again this season in a great way. And it's a great setup for when he says Cardassians and Romulans are no longer a threat. The only real threat is the Klingons and the Federation, which totally sets up season 4. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but it completely sets up what they do in season 4, which I'll get to more when I get to season 4. But the one downside I would say, which again had more to do with the Dias cast, which, as I said, was probably, even though I still loved it, I probably liked the Improbable Calls more. But in the Dias cast, there's a storyline about Sisko defying orders and stealing the Defiant to go into the Gamma Quadrant to save Odo. That was all kind of cliche, especially the way it's like, who wants to volunteer? And everyone volunteers. So I'm kind of sick. And at the end, the Admiral's just like, if you do that again, I'll court-martial you or I'll promote you. It makes it seem like there's no consequences for disobeying Starfleet orders whatsoever. Starfleet orders are more like suggestions. But anyway, other than that, still love this episode. Get into the next episode, which is Explorers, which I think a lot of people like. I don't. Sorry. I think this episode's boring. I think it tries too hard to be like a sailing ship metaphor. I mean, obviously, but it just tries too hard. I mean, I don't actively have a problem with Jake as a character. I guess the only problem I have with Jake is that it seems obvious to me that the writers have a hard time making him relevant. As a character himself, I don't mind him. Like, I don't find him annoying the way I find Nog annoying. But they never seem to be able to do anything interesting with him. In contrast to Nog, which they can do some interesting things with him from time to time, even though I really don't like that character. But with Jake, whenever they focus on him, or most of the time, there's a huge exception, which I'll get to in season 4, but usually when they focus on him, it's just, they don't know what to do, and it comes off as a bit boring. And I think this episode's a prime example. I know it's supposed to be great father and son interaction, but it's all over, let's go on this sailing ship to prove the Bajorans were ancient Bajorans sailed to Cardassia years ago, blah, 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 blah. It was just, I didn't like it at all. I'm sorry. I had nothing about this I found interesting. I think the main storyline about the Bajorans going as an ancient ship and going to Cardassia and Cisco proving them was right. Who cares? I don't care. And it was a wasted appearance of Dukat. Like, I'm going to prove you wrong. Blah, 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 blah. Anyway, move on to the next episode, which is Family Business. So I said how the Ferengi episodes in season 3 were probably the best of the show. Well, alright. Family Business, it's not horrible, I will say that. But it's not the best Ferengi episode. I mean, I think it's kind of okay. It's still not really bad as some of the other Ferengi episodes and some of the other seasons. Because it was interesting that it explored Ferengi culture a lot more. Like, I love this particular interchange. Like, Brunt had to pay to go into Quark's home. Quark had to pay just to sit down, and it cost too much to use the elevator, so he used the stairs. Just how, I think it was I don't think it was a concrete commentary on capitalism, but it was more like snide elbow hitting against capitalism, where it's like, this is how bad it could get. Or not capitalism in general, but more of the cheesier, sleazier aspects of capitalism, like used car salesmen and stuff, which is something I think that the Deep Space Nine era changed the Ferengi to, whereas in the Next Generation, Roddenberry era is supposed to be putting down capitalism altogether, whereas Deep Space Nine era focused more on the sleazy aspect of it, which is fine. It was interesting getting that in this episode, and I loved seeing more of that and getting the introduction of Brunt and Moogie. I mean, that started a whole thing. Like, everyone who says Ishka, you're like, who the hell's Ishka? No, it's Moogie. Oh, Moogie. So the episode did do a good job of it, because this is what established the whole thing around. Always going around going, Moogie. I mean, that was classic. You had to give it up to that. But the thing that made this episode annoying is basically the whole episode was Quark saying to his mother, you can't earn profits. She's like, yes I can. No you can't. Yes I can. No you can't. Yes I can. No you can't. Yes I can. No, that's the episode. So that's why it's not a really good plot. It's kind of repetitive and annoying. I mean, but there are good character interactions and cultural explanations mixed in with that. And we also get a B plot, which I believe, I'm sorry, I binge watched the episode, so I try to get the B plots of these last couple episodes mixed up, but I'm pretty sure this is the one that had Bashir getting nominated for this award that he thought he knew he was going to lose, but he kind of secretly wanted to win. Everyone kept giving him, oh, you're going to win, and he lost. Apparently, I didn't realize this until very recently. Apparently, this was a jab. The Deep Space Nine writers are kind of doing this as a jab to Next Generation, which was nominated for an Emmy for Best Drama Show this year. and they of course lost. And so they're kind of jabbing at them, and like because they knew they weren't going to win, but it was an honor just to get nominated. I don't know. I don't really think it works. I thought once I learned that story, I think it makes sense that that's what they're doing, because it doesn't really make sense with Bashir in the story, in the world of Deep Space Nine. It seems really out of place. Didn't really care for it. Anyway, let's get into the next episode, which is Shakaar. I really enjoyed this episode. Again, I know some people were more sour on the Bajoran episodes. I don't think they're the best of Deep Space Nine, but I think they can really work. And this episode in particular was really interesting commentary on politics. It has a great quote from Odo where he says the problem with freedom of choice is sometimes people make the wrong choice. Which, again, I don't want to get too much into current political landscapes, but boy howdy is this relevant. And also it's relevant for the fact that Kai Wynn took credit for something she didn't do, which is making peace with Cardassia, and so she gained so much popularity that people were able to give her like a free pass, and they wanted her to become not just the Kai, but the first minister, the leader of Bajor political government, basically, as well. And I love how this episode explores how someone who so doesn't deserve power can gain it. But I also love how Kira and Shakaar are able to prove that she doesn't deserve this power to the people at large. And basically because she is not anything that Kira does, is the fact that Kai Wynn just keeps making one blunder after another, proving that she can't handle such power. And I thought that was interesting. I really liked that. I'm not sure. I didn't like the fact that we find out in this episode that the leader of Kira's resistance cell was named Shakaar, because we heard this name dropped all the way back in my favorite episode, Duet, where Maritza looked up which cell that Kira was in, and she mentioned she was in the Shakaar resistance cell. I don't think it makes sense for the Shakaar resistance cell to be named after the leader. That seems kind of bland to me. It also seems like it's, Angel, it's making the leader come off more of a hero, more of a figurehead. It seems like Shakaar should just be named after something else, like an animal or something, and it'd be led by some guy. So it doesn't matter who leads them, because what if Shakaar died? Would they have to change the name of the resistance? I don't know. So I think that was lazy on the writer's part. Like, oh, it's a Shakaar resistance cell, so let's have a guy named Shakaar. And it's played by the same actor who played the space ghost that Dr. Crusher was making out with on Subversive, by the way. I don't know if you knew that. And so, not the best, not really in love with this actor. He's like the handsome man stereotype again. But I still like the episode. I think it was really interesting to see Kira reminisce with those who were in her resistance cell and the kind of relationship they had, and see them interacting. I think that really worked. I did like this a lot. Now, this also had a B plot with Bashir meeting up with his old classmate who was the valedictorian. Like, there was this line all the way back in Q-List where Bashir said that he missed a question on his final quiz, and it seems like the writers latched onto that, and so there's several references to that in season 3, and I think it's not that interesting. We don't really need that much follow-up on it, but I did like the fact that Bashir, when he goes up to her, and she just walks right past him, so he thinks that she's being rude, that she's purposely ignoring him, but then finds out that she didn't even know who he was, and she thought he was an Andorian. That was funny, because I love how that shows how sometimes people can get so wrapped up into thinking that other people's behaviors because it has something to do with them, when in fact it has nothing to do with them. So I did like that. So anyway, we get into the next episode, which is Facelets. So this episode, again, another Trill episode, is kind of fun. So it kind of works for me. I think it's an okay episode. We explore Dax's backstory and history. We meet all her different hosts, which is interesting. I think it's interesting that we get character definitions for each of her hosts, which is something they didn't really do before. They kind of touched on them a bit, but I love actually get to see them interact. However, I think the whole concept of having this ceremony where this weird guy comes on board and says a bunch of weird shit and blah 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 in a language and transfers the energy from Dax to the other person, I don't know, something about that seems silly to me, something about that I don't buy. Also, I didn't like the way they portrayed Duran in this episode, and I won't like how they portray him in the future episode either. I think it's completely inconsistent with how he was established in Equilibrium. He was just established as a normal guy who was a bit loose, and so he was a bit off his springs, and he ended up killing someone. But here, they portray him more as, like, totally insane. Cold-blooded killer. He takes over Sisko's body and starts slamming his head against the force field and chanting against Dax and saying Jadzia and saying she's not worth having the symbiont. And I didn't like that. I don't think that was totally inconsistent with how he was established before. Also, Curzon's storyline in this episode seemed an artificial way to create tension. Like, oh, I don't want to go back into you. And then find out the big reveal, oh, I was in love with you. I'm like, oh, that's cheesy. Sorry, I didn't really care for that. But I did think the prospect of having Odo and Curzon joining and becoming one, and that the ceremony worked differently for Changeling, that was interesting. And I think it was an interesting character exploration for Odo, that Odo was actually partially involved, and basically he joined with Curzon. Again, the science behind this is questionable, but it was an interesting character story. And I really like the side plot, the B plot with, and I believe this is the episode, with Quark sabotaging Nog's attempt to take the Starfleet Academy test. And when Rom finds out about it, he gets all up in Quark's face and it's like, no, you want, and just like lays down the law, something we never seen Rom do. And it's so great to show, and again, completely inconsistent with how he's portrayed in earlier seasons, but again, this is the better Rom, so let's overlook that. And completely how he just like stands up for his son and is like, you will not do this, I will burn your bar down to the ground. That was great. I did really enjoy that. Anyway, let us get to the season finale, The Adversary, which was a really intense and suspenseful episode. Absolutely great. Because you never know, it has that really high tension again, but in a very different way, because it's not that, oh, everyone's going to die. It's like they could start a whole war that could wipe out the Federation, and you can tell this is a great use of the changelings and showing how they use their changeling, their espionage, to affect political change. That's not just plain old like the Borg, where we're just going to come in and defeat you. Is a lot more insidious than that, and that's something very different. It was really separates Dominion from the Borg, and this episode in particular was so intense, where the Sisko and crew were trapped on the Defiant, and they had no control over anything, and they were having to figure out who the Changeling was and trying to like overcome the devices at the same time. And Changeling was actually very good at hiding who he was and pretending to be Bashir, pretending to be the ambassador, and at the end he had the two Odos next to each other. That was all great. I love that all. I think that worked really well. Also, I love how they sort of hint at some things, because in the earlier scene where you see O'Brien goes into the turbo lift and he sees Jeffrey Tube, and he sees Bashir there, you can tell, like watching that in retrospect, you can tell that that's not Bashir, that he's acting really weird, and you can tell that's a changeling. But when you first see it, it does make sense that it wouldn't click with O'Brien, because he doesn't even know there's a changeling on board. So you wouldn't think he would, it would seem a bit weird to him, but he wouldn't make the jump to you're the changeling. But once the changeling is there, it makes everyone too suspicious. And how that Bolian assumed that Kira was a changeling, because everyone's too assuming, oh, you're acting a little bit strange, you're the changeling. And I love that. It plays, and it does it so well in the confined space where it's just the ship. It's a totally different dynamic when they get into this in season 4. So it's so great seeing that here. One issue I had with this episode is, who the hell is Zenkethy? I mean, they never mentioned before or again after this episode, and yet they're seen as some alien that having a war with who could war with the Federation and destabilize the region. It seemed like they should have used an established race, not just some made up another race, whatever. That kind of bothered me. But I don't know. When I first saw this episode, I had certain expectations on how Star Trek season finale should go. I'm used to the TNG two-parter where cliffhanger type thing, and I was really expecting something like that, but instead you just get kind of Odo saying something shocking. And this will become, they do this again in season 4. I guess I'll touch more on this in season 4, because 2 seasons in a row they end the season with Odo saying something shocking. This one I think works a bit better. Well, it was the first time they did it, first of all, so it wasn't repetitive. But secondly, what he says is quite shocking. That he reveals that before the Changeling died, he said, "It's too late, we're everywhere." And that is fucking shocking. So I do think that was a great cliffhanger, even though it wasn't the one I was looking for. It wasn't like a two-parter type thing that Next Generation always did. But it was still a great way to end the season. Anyway, that is all the episodes of season 3. So now it is time for me to go back and name the worst episode of the season and the best episode of the season, in my opinion. So we'll start with my least favorite episode, or the worst episode of season 3. So there were a few, even though I love the season, there were a few contenders for this, like Meridian, Fascination, and Explorers, but I definitely have to go with Distant Voices. That's the worst episode of season 3. This is clearly not a good episode. They didn't know what they were doing. The old man makeup was horrible. The being inside someone's head was cheesy. This episode is just a failure in every conceivable way. Alright, so now we have to go into the best episode, my favorite episode of season 3, which I think there were a lot of good episodes this season, but there were some episodes that particularly stood out, like Civil Defense, Visionary, the Improbable Cause, and the Dias Cast, and The Adversary. But the episode I'll have to go to as the best episode of season 3 is Past Tense. As I said, I think is one of the best episodes of the entire show. Great two-parter that made some powerful commentary. Great supporting cast. Great character explanation of Bashir and Sisko. And just a very unique episode of Deep Space Nine, making it my favorite episode of Season 3. So, as for my rating out of 10 for Season 3, I'm going to give Season 3 a 10, the best. Now, just a reminder, when I give 10s to seasons, it doesn't mean it's perfect, because there's no such thing as a perfect season. Even season 5 of Breaking Bad wasn't perfect, and that's my favorite season of all time. Every season has its up and down, so a 10 is relative towards a season of television. So for me, a 10 of a season of television is the best a season could be, and that's what I think this is. Even though it has some poor episodes like Distant Voices and the one Louis Oxana Troy Fascination, still overall, I think the characters really came together. Even in the bad episodes, they had good character interactions. It painted a clear picture of what Deep Space Nine wanted to be, especially as compared to the earlier seasons. They really gelled, found its footing. It had the threat of Dominion, even though they didn't appear all the time. It was always there, an undercurrent in the show, driving the season forward, which I think was amazing. So that is it for my review of Season 3 of Deep Space Nine. I will be back in a month for my review of Season 4 of Deep Space Nine, so be sure to check that out. You can also check out my channel for many other Star Trek videos, as well as I do other videos on other shows, like Game of Thrones, The Expanse, Lost, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.